as well.
So I appreciate that, Charity. I'm going to go ahead and do a couple quick slides on FCA Atlanta here, and then we'll jump into the conversation. So for those of you that aren't familiar with FCA Atlanta, we're a nonprofit organization based in the Atlanta metro area. There are 2 other chapters in Georgia, one out of Macon and one out of Fort Gordon. We have approximately 300 members, 65 corporate members, and about a quarter of those are our life members that have been members for a long time and will be. FCA International is our parent organization. They've got approximately 30,000 members worldwide, 138 chapters, and 1,515 corporate sponsors. And the corporate sponsors are everything from Raytheon, Lockheed, AT&T, to much smaller organizations that might just be a couple of folks that have a contract with the government that see the benefit of actually being a member of FCA. Our activities are generally based around the community, doing thought leadership, knowledge share, through networking, live events, and webinars like this. We generally have monthly meetings, and there are some other meetings that are scheduled, we have an upcoming cybersecurity summit, a critical infrastructure summit, and then we have an event up at North Georgia in April that's going to be involved with the retirement of Lieutenant General Fogarty from Cyber Command. We also do teacher tool grants that are coming up in March, and we have an annual event at USO at the Archfield Airport where we support the troops coming home. And so sorry if I'm in a kind of a rush, but James, you want?
Hey, Charity, while we're waiting, can you give us a little of your background?
Sure. I'll introduce myself. My name is Charity Wright. I am currently a Cyber Threat Intelligence Analyst at Recorded Future. Before this, I started my career in the U.S. Army. So I served for 10 years, 5 active duty, 5 Army National Guard, and I served as a Chinese linguist. I was stationed at the National Security Agency for 4 years, where I did intelligence analysis and linguistics there. And that was a pretty fulfilling role. But then I decided to kind of switch over to the private sector. So I started working in cyber threat intelligence about 6 years ago. And I just love it because, as you guys know, every day is exciting and there's something new to investigate. So I started out in the corporate end, actually. I did cyber threat intelligence for an MSSP and for Hilton Worldwide. And then I was at Ernst & Young for 2 years to help establish that CTI and Fusion team there. And that's when I decided to jump into the, I guess you could say, vendor side, actually working for an intelligence company and really digging in more into dark web intelligence, disinformation as a service. And I also am a specialist in China and Chinese cyber threats. And so I follow a lot of geopolitical topics as well.
Take it over.
Absolutely will. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's discussion. Sorry for the mix-up there. I blame Paul for every and all of the world's problems, and none on myself or Charity at all. So
I'll take the hit on that. So
is he still there?
did we just lose James? James, you're muted.
now I'm unmuted. Here we go. Now you can hear me. So I'm proud to be an FCM member. I'm even more proud to have Charity Wright joining us today. And she gave a little bit of her background as people were joining on, so I won't have her repeat it. I want to get and dig right into today's topic, which is China. And Charity, in your experience, we've obviously seen a lot of things recently around China and the malign activity. And a lot of it goes towards who's the greater cybersecurity threat to our nation? Is it Russia or China? So would you mind just sharing a little bit about what we should know, or what kind of dis or misinformation's out there in regards to China in the cybersecurity space?
Sure. I think China is definitely in the top two with Russia as at least the greatest adversaries that we have in the US as far as cyber operations go. And that is because they have very, very developed operations, both military and in their communist government party. And they really have found ways to utilize all of their assets around the world to collect intelligence to achieve their objectives. Now, that's not to say necessarily that they're better than Russia. I think Russia and China are pretty equal when it comes to their capabilities and their motivations. I think motivation has a lot to do with it. There are threat actors all over the world that are capable of conducting really serious attacks. But what is the motivation behind it? What is driving those campaigns and those behaviors? And really, when we look at China, they are extremely driven. They're extremely resourceful. And I think that they have a much more cohesive system going on than Russia does. There's not as much infighting and conflict, at least that they show on the outside. They really have this one mind, one objective type of mindset. So they really pool their resources all together towards working towards this one objective, which is economic dominance, economic growth, a slow and steady rise to power. And so I think, it's hard to compare Russia and China because they do have different objectives, but there are some similarities there too. So I would say that China is definitely one of the top cyber threats in the world. But really, we would have to dig in a little bit deeper into their objectives and what they're going for.
Brilliant. So let me ask you, as we kind of look at China over a period of time, we obviously see that recently there's been a lot of attributions towards, basically SolarWinds and now Acelion, and there's been a mix. A lot of people are convinced Russia started it, but China's been a benefit of it. How real is that threat for the U.S. from a SolarWinds perspective, or even the Acelion and Centrion breaches that have been going on over the last 2 weeks?
I think this SolarWinds incident and FireEye and all of these organizations that were targeted recently, they're all being attributed to the same campaign or the same threat actor. And I find it interesting that there's just now some intel coming out about how, yes, we believe these were Russian created tools and that campaign was started by Russia. But we also found some indication that China just came in through that back door too, and that they are also in these networks and systems. I think that's really important to acknowledge, and for us all to kind of keep an open mind about who might be, not only who originated the campaign, but also who's going to follow suit and kind of go in there and try to steal whatever, proprietary information is in there too. So yes, the US government is attributing it to Russia, and they're implementing consequences for that on Russia. I think we're waiting to see what the Biden administration is going to do about that. But it's also important to keep in mind that Russia is not the only adversary that's capable and motivated to conduct these types of attacks.
That's a brilliant point. China's been for a long time focused on stealing US IP. In fact, their fighter jet, the J-35, looks eerily similar to one of our very own, developed jets that have been targeting military government infrastructure through different types of campaigns. What should people be aware of as part of the, supply chain risk? Because so much stuff originates from China. And in your years of studying Chinese culture and obviously doing the work that you do in China, what is one common misconception we may have about achieving that end goal?
Yeah. Oh gosh. Well, within research circles right now, and within the CTI community, I see a lot of misconceptions about China because they publicly state that they're going to do one thing. Like years ago, they've made agreements in the past not to conduct offensive cyber operations targeting the U.S. But the misconception is that a lot of people take them at their word. A lot of researchers believe that China wants this slow, peaceful rise, but their actions speak much louder. And that is that behind the scenes, China's ideology, their Communist Party ideology, and going back thousands of years of different philosophy, is that nothing is off limits. They are fluent in asymmetrical warfare, and really, they believe that the ends justify the means. So it's important for us as researchers and analysts to really have a, I think it's kind of a zero trust policy with China, is that they have to show through their actions that they're willing to follow through with what they're promising. And so far, we're not seeing that. We have evidence of, hundreds of campaigns and actually hundreds of spies all over the world that are working for the Chinese government. I was just actually looking through a list of Chinese spies that have been caught around the world conducting espionage operations. It's really mind blowing how long the list is and how many have actually been convicted with hard evidence. One of the statistics I read is that 60% of all intellectual property theft in the US ties back to China. They are the ones that are conducting these campaigns. So, what is China going after? What do they really care about? We know that they have researchers, professors, scientists, doctors, engineers in every relevant industry collecting information and handing it over to the Chinese Communist Party, which is then distributed to their private sector, to front companies, to scientists, engineers, and educators. We have evidence that there have been Chinese spies infiltrating military education like Harvard, MIT, NASA, and they really do go after every industry because their objective is economic growth. The more money they have, the more power they have. And they're implementing that not only through espionage, but also through control of ports around the world and building out naval infrastructure in the South China Sea to enable their economy, to enable import export around, in their region and with their neighbors. So it's interesting to see how people still have some kind of hope that China is still trying to rise peacefully when their actions clearly say the opposite.
So one of the things that you brought up here was the China papers, the 1.9 million CCP members that are spread out across the entire world, that are working in organizations that have infiltrated levels of governments, not only in the US, but also globally. And that has some serious implications for a lot of universities and organizations with exchange programs. So while we talk about the China problem, what are some of the things that we can do to maybe change our mindset and ways to start remedying some of the threats that come through from China? And how can we be more effective in dealing with those?
Yeah. Well, when it comes to protecting our organizations, cyber threat intelligence is the priority. You need to be aware of what they're doing. You need to be aware of new threat groups that are forming and what their objectives are, and how are their tactics changing. Because unlike some, misunderstandings about China, they don't just use the same tools and techniques. Over the decades, we have seen them evolve from, strictly military operations and using certain types of malware that they've created. And yes, they still use, PlugX and all their typical malware families, but they're also adopting new tactics and techniques. So it's very important for us to keep up with what's going on, to be able to ingest those indicators of compromise, and also to be, I would say, just, kind of evangelizing that Russia is not just the only big threat. As an analyst, oftentimes we use confirmation bias. We shouldn't be doing that, but confirmation bias, you guys probably know, is when you have a theory about something and you go out seeking intelligence to prove that point. Instead of trying to confirm what you believe, why don't you just, with an open mind, go, okay, I see this, SolarWinds campaign, for example. We have a list of the tactics and the tools that were used. We have a lot of intelligence gaps that we don't know about, but why don't we compare and contrast these pieces of information that we do have to the threat actors and the threat groups that we know exist, and use those tools and tactics. But also it's important for us to analyze their motivations. In order to understand our adversaries, you really have to get into their mindset and understand, the culture and the objectives of that state in particular. Russia and China, although they do have similarities with, communist states, and the leaders have certain qualities in common, they also have very different objectives for what they want for their country in the future. So I think as analysts, it's important for us to not get so hyper-focused on the technical indicators, but also understand the more strategic perspective of what they're going for. And that will enable us to think ahead and be more proactive to protect ourselves against these threat groups.
I love that answer. So, and thank you, because you bring up something very important, which is, you mentioned something earlier that I want to go to, because I feel like that's one of the biggest gaps that we have here in the US, and maybe you can address that slightly. There's a lot of cohesiveness within China over the overall goals, right? Because the goal is set by the Chinese Communist Party leadership. It's a 100-year goal. It's a 50-year goal. There's no politics there. There's no deviation. Every single person on that list is working towards that goal. The US is a little different. How do we empower ourselves, even with our differences, to really overcome the Chinese challenge that's currently posing a threat to our not only national security, but also our economical security in the country?
Yeah. Oh man, that's a really good question. I feel like if I had the answer, I'd be running to NSA and FBI with these suggestions. Yes, China does have an advantage because they are one party working towards one objective. And if you fall out of line, you're going to be punished. So it's pretty much everybody on board. Here's what we're going for. And what's funny is they're so transparent about their plans and their objectives. And from what I can see written down and what we've translated from their actual, documents and publications is we take it, we read it, and we go, okay, in 50 years, they want to get to this point. But it's almost like we can't understand how they're going to get there. But when you have all your resources pulled towards one objective, it's not that hard. Us, on the other hand, we also have some advantages over that system. And that is, in America, we are taught from a very young age to think outside the box, to think creatively, to creatively solve problems. And I think that we have an extreme advantage in that way. China tends to steal intellectual property and mimic the tools that are created by the United States and Western countries. Essentially, I think they're thinking of it like a cost-efficient way. Like, instead of, making a completely new tool, let's just repurpose this one that we can steal from NSA or that was leaked from NSA. But the problem with that is we've seen it before and we can stop it. we have an advantage over them in creative thinking and problem solving, because we have people that have different worldviews, different perspectives, different experiences. And so I think it's important for us to foster that creativity, to continually challenge threat actors like Chinese APTs and Russian APTs. We have to kind of get into their mind and think, what would they do next? And then we can solve that problem more creatively. So I guess my advice would be, for InfoSec professionals, continue to foster that diversity in your program and invite people that are not just specialists in those countries. Like, let's say, I'm hired to consult on China because that's my area of specialization. I would also want people around me that don't specialize in China or cyber, or maybe they have a different perspective on, fighting against China in a different country. Like maybe they served on a cybersecurity team in Vietnam or the Philippines, or anywhere, and had to actually confront Chinese threats. I think it's important to foster that kind of creativity and really embrace what we in the Western world have established as the norm, because China's after it, and they're always coming after our stuff. So we must be doing something right.
Yeah, we do a lot of things right, so that's why they're coming after it. I would like to think, but when you look at we talk a lot about China, and we hear a lot about China from a cyber threat perspective, but also geopolitically. They've made some strategic moves in Hong Kong recently. How are those moves part of their overall plan? And some of the security experiments that they did, the cybersecurity stuff of cutting off the internet in the island of Hong Kong, or moving the Chinese firewall into Hong Kong, has had significant impact on a lot of the researchers that were in Hong Kong. How have you seen that have you seen that have any impact from an intel perspective within the island of Hong Kong?
Yeah, let me start on the first part of that question. China's objectives long-term are to build its reputation, save face on the global stage. They really care a lot about appearing to be competent. This will help them establish healthier relationships with their regional partners. And also and we'll get into disinformation in a little bit, but they also really like to promote this view that their leaders are competent, that their system of governance is better than democratic governments. And so that really is the foundation for a lot of their actions, including crackdowns on pro-democracy movements. It helps them maintain control of their constituency and their population. And that goes for both, minority groups in China, like Mongolians and minorities in the northern provinces, and also the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong. But now China is even reaching outside of their borders and providing support to governments all over their, the APAC region, trying to support the governments that are pushing against pro-democracy movements. So really, when you see this type of action, you go, I wonder why they're attacking this group or that group. Why wouldn't they be spending that time and effort on something more tangible? It's because they really do believe that their Chinese communist system is the ideal, and they want to promote that in that region as kind of a bubble of protection for them against democratic adversaries like the US and our allies. So that's the first part of that question of like, why are they doing this? And the second part, with Hong Kong, I've been really, most of my time in the past 6 months has been spent on counter-disinformation. So I haven't really been in the weeds with, let's say, our customers at Recorded Future and what they're dealing with in Hong Kong. But I have been monitoring and detecting the kind of influence operations that they're running there.
Okay, so we have a few questions. Why don't we take one of those?
Okay.
One of the questions we have here, who has better offensive capabilities, the US or China and Russia?
Offensive capabilities. The unclassified version, I would definitely argue that the US does. However, we have been very, very focused on defense over the past, decade. And I think that recently military leaders, NSA leaders have really been pushing for a more proactive, I think they're calling it active defense measures. So yes, I think USA does, but I'm biased, so I have to admit that. And of course, I can't explain all the reasons why I support that statement. But I guess the unclassified version would be that we have assets operating in both offensive and defensive ways that most of us that are not in the cleared space anymore are unaware of. And I think you would hear about a lot more incidents, like major incidents, if we weren't as sophisticated as we are.
All right, so we have questions are flowing in, so we're going to start kind of answering those as we go along. And the other question is around the DPRK. I'll read this out. So can you please speak about the DPRK and on their abilities combined with China and Russia?
Yes, Ronald, thank you for asking that question. North Korea is an interesting one. They're kind of like, I think a lot of people look down on them and make fun of them because they really seem very desperate sometimes with their operations. But this is where we come back to the topic of motivation. This nation and its regime is very financially motivated. They have suffered from sanctions. So what they're trying to do is not only pay back, but also fund their objectives, whether that's nuclear or cyber, stealing technology and information to get ahead. It really is, for North Korea, it really is a race to somehow obtain money and circumvent the sanctions that have been put on them. So that goes back to their main objectives and their main motivation. I think they are a dangerous adversary, and they have learned over the past 10 years how to adapt to defensive measures that we've implemented, and also, create their own tools or repurpose tools that they've stolen. So they're very adaptive. They're very creative. I think a lot of people underestimate them. And so we have to be very careful because they do, they're not conducting operations. We don't see operations coming out about them every day, but when they do, it's usually pretty serious and has affected many organizations in several industries. So I think it's important to take them seriously. Now, I'm not sure about, I can't really speak to combined operations between North Korea and China and Russia. Usually they're operating on their own. There are some partnerships between those countries. I'm sure there's intelligence sharing and sharing of tools and such, but from what we can tell, their cyber operations operate pretty independently.
So North Korea is predominantly after money, right? And you were great to highlight that. China's predominantly after IP, but China's been really promoting the Chinese communist system across the world in a lot of disinformation and misinformation campaigns. And I know that you and I kind of spoke about this in December. But can you speak a little bit about kind of how China's really trying to launch disinformation and misinformation campaigns?
Oh, yes. So China operates in the influence operation space a little differently than everybody else. They primarily have two different ways that they use influence operations. And by influence operations, I should clarify, I mean disinformation, misinformation, manipulation of information, narrative warfare, because essentially influence ops are ineffective if there's not a story. So it's all about the narrative that's being spread, and we analyze what is the story and what does that support? Whose minds are they trying to change? Two ways they do this. One is internally with their own people. So as most of you probably know, China has a very insulated internet environment for within China. They have great control over apps, websites, social media that can be used. And they have a very professional system of media, state affiliated media that they own and manage and monitor to ensure that the narrative is cohesive across the country. That is their way of controlling what information their people have access to and what they believe about China and about other countries as well. So their first method is by controlling the narrative within China. Usually that looks like China's great. Look at how great our leaders are. Everything is running so smoothly. This was just a hiccup. Hong Kong pro-democracy people are terrorists. And so they really paint the pro-democracy movement as a terrorist organization. And so within China, that is the mindset is communism is great, democracy is bad, and that's the narrative they stick with over the years. The second objective they do is everything outside of China. So they've got the domestic thing covered. They've got great control over that. The way that they influence people outside of China is by using media front companies, using foreign media outlets, and using their own media outlets to share and amplify messages that are, against the U.S., against their adversaries, promoting China as competent. For example, COVID-19. As soon as COVID became a really big problem in China, they started pushing out this narrative that it wasn't a leak from a Chinese lab. It was actually a leak from a US lab, and creating these false stories that point the blame towards somebody else. And by doing that, they're redirecting criticism from foreign governments and foreign leaders, and they're trying to establish themselves as let's say, stable, competent, handling things intelligently. And that is how they try to build partnerships and maintain what they're doing to invest around the world. So China is investing millions and millions of dollars into ports and infrastructure all over the world. Certain areas of Africa, the Middle East, Israel even, they are investing heavily into, critical infrastructure and vital maritime infrastructure all over the world to enable their Belt and Road Initiative. So a lot of the disinformation that they're spreading around the world has to do with their competency, their ability to be a world leader, their ability to conduct these types of investment activities around the world.
All right. The problem of unmuting on time, right? Like you and I should have the cue. Every time you're about 3 words out, just, play with your hair or something, and that'll cue me up. I know we've got a few more questions here. I want to take the audience questions. So This comes from Patricia Harrington. As I've traveled, I've noticed China moving into a lot of third world countries, using Chinese nationals only to build infrastructure for the local government. How do we combat this movement in third world countries to show different sides of ways of government?
Patricia, I think you and I were thinking the same things. I didn't even see your question when I started talking about that. So that's a perfect segue. Our research team at Recorded Future, we're called Insect Group. We are following very closely the development of critical infrastructure all over the world that is sponsored by China. So we've seen this buildup of, military infrastructure, artificial islands and reefs in the South China Sea. We've also seen them conducting illegal activities, sending undersea drones through territories of water where they're not allowed, and then also build up in Africa and Middle East, and some illegal trading of weapons and oil, things like this. So we know that this is happening all over the world, and it's happening quietly and kind of slowly. And then, for example, there's one base that they built out in Djibouti that we've been watching very closely. And the reason that we're monitoring this is because we also see large movements of materials, of equipment, of oil, and actually people. They're moving a lot of Chinese nationals to these other countries, not only to build the infrastructure, to build military bases and build, let's say internet infrastructure they're building out in some of these countries. That means China is going to have control over the internet infrastructure in those foreign countries as well. So we're monitoring these things closely. How do we combat this movement? I think it's a very American mindset for us to go, hey, that's not good, we need to stop them. But really, we don't always have a right to stop them from investing and building out infrastructure in other countries. Instead, I say we monitor closely. We can also invest in those areas. I think it's important to encourage our private sector to kind of counter that competition in those areas. And, I'm not an economics expert at all, but that's what I have seen and observed some of the experts recommending as well. As far as military buildup goes, I think it's very important for everyone to understand that the private sector is hand in hand with the public sector in China. The Chinese Communist government and the party really dictate all of the rules of what happens in the private sector. And that's not just federal regulation. I mean, they are in the fine details, and they have, former military members and government workers planted as leaders in those private sector companies to appear to be independent of the government, but they're really not. So it's important for us to kind of keep an eye on who's managing which companies, who's building up, the infrastructure in those countries. Is it military or is it private sector? What are they developing there, and what are their objectives? Monitoring that and kind of countering it with our private sector, which is very active, I think would be a good method.
So you brought up a great point about our private sector investing. One of the common hindrances here, and I'm not asking you a question, I'm making a statement of fact, is because I'm like, I don't want to put you under the bus again and just be like, hey, how do we solve all the world's problems, Charity? How do we achieve world peace? But one of the common challenges for a lot of private sector companies in the US to compete with China in different parts of APAC and Africa is the strict anti-corruption laws that we have in the US that you can be prosecuted for in the US and Europe, where in China, those don't exist. Like in China and in the Middle East, they have no problem doing the whole bakshish, mentality of tipping a government official to get something, or employing, kind of those different aspects of operating that we in the States and in the EU can't really work against, because we can't really compete with, simply because of the anti-corruption laws in place.
Yeah. It's ironic that President Xi Jinping, he really, he kind of campaigns as this anti-corruption leader, which is ironic because there's a lot of corruption in the Communist Party. And it's now been revealed that he has been kind of the brains behind the internment camps for minorities in the North. So it's kind of ironic. They do have anti-corruption laws in China, but it's not what you would think. It's not like what we have in America or in Western democratic countries. It's really more of a mechanism to keep control of what's happening within the party, not necessarily eliminating corruption. So I think that's kind of a common misconception there.
So that's a wonderful point. And I kind of want to take this just, slightly that way. What's the domestic situation in China like? I mean, we obviously know of the camps for Uyghur Muslims, in parts of China that are going on. What's happening? Hong Kong a few days ago had, I think, 3 million people almost out protesting pro-democracy movement, which is, I think, nearly half of the population on the island, according to some figures that I saw. There's obviously some internal conflict brewing within China. Why is it so hard to get that information? And so why is it so hard to get that information? And then number two, what is the domestic situation like in China?
Well, as you know, the Chinese government does not allow criticism of the Communist Party or its practices. So, of course, they're locking down mainstream media, trying to eliminate leaks of photos, videos. There's persecution of Western media outlets. A couple of my friends are major news reporters in China for some American news networks too, and they're very restricted on what they're allowed to do, where they're allowed to go, what they're allowed to report on. So that's why it's so difficult to get the truth behind what's going on, but there's always leaks, and we rely on those leaks, and we rely on the transparency that our Western outlets give us. Now, what's happening in China? And full disclosure, I've never lived in China. I was trained by native speakers and experts here in the United States. But currently, the democratic movement that's happening all over the Asia region is a critical threat to Chinese communism. So, of course, they're trying to crack down on it right away. But as it grows, they're finding it to be a consistent problem. So I think that these pro-democracy movements are really giving the communist government a run for their money. And I don't think the biggest threat is from within. I think the biggest threat is from regional neighbors in Southeast Asia. We see pro-democracy movements happening all over the region, including in Myanmar right now, which is experiencing a military coup. They came in and took over for a pro-democracy leader, and now the people are, unfortunately protesting, being killed in the streets for it. China is, in the meantime, we have intel actually as of this week to indicate that there are these secret undercover shipments of some kinds of goods, or we're not really sure what exactly is on these airplanes yet, but they have been conducted from China to Myanmar. And we've seen China support communist governments in the region, like Vietnam, crack down on pro-democracy movements. So they're kind of positioning themselves as like the big bad communist giant in the region and helping their other communist neighbors crack down on these things, because it really is a battle of ideologies.
Yeah, battle of ideologies. So
Sorry, I was like to twirl my hair.
We are at the top of the hour. Charity, thank you so much for jumping on. I want to make sure I didn't leave any questions out here lastly, and I think we are. Paul has one question, and any idea on what kind of acts or when cyber offense will be considered an act of war?
Ooh, that's a good one. That kind of came up, I want to say it was like last year, early last year, the year before that, maybe late 2019, when I was actually in Israel at that time training for work. And there was a big event that happened between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip, where they had been actually firing back and forth, like physical weapons. And then in that process, Israel discovered and detected where cyber attacks were coming from as well. So they fired a missile onto that building where the cyber operators were operating. So it kind of brought up this conversation around what's the line between physical warfare and cyber warfare? And is it fair to call all cyber attacks cyber warfare? Or are we trying to give it this tangible label that gives us kind of a way to make sense of what's happening? I think cyber offense is considered an act of war when it targets critical infrastructure, human lives, including hospitals. I think ransomware that targets a hospital in the middle of a COVID-19 pandemic, I think that's an act of war. But how do we pin that on a cyber criminal if it's not, an actual state-sponsored attack? So it's still very cloudy. And, that's just my personal opinion, is that when you're purposely attacking critical infrastructure and just targeting that critical infrastructure that helps uphold a society, I think that's where it crosses that line. But I know people disagree with me on that, so that's fine.
I wouldn't say disagree with you. Back to backs. All right. So, so I will say this. I wouldn't disagree with you on what you said. I remember being in Israel when, I think at the same time you were in, when the IDF blew up the Hamas cyber command building. And it was a changing of the game. But I think in the US, it's a little different there. To answer Paul's question a little bit, when we were on the Hill and talking about cyber warfare possibly being something like that, the challenge is whatever law you pass in a democratic country essentially forces us to make a move. So if we pass a law and say any attack on our electrical grid is a declaration of war, you kind of lose the concept of declaration of war. You make it really cheap. And so from a cyber perspective, we can say one thing, though. I think this is like declassified at this point, but every time there's been a major cyber attack, we've kind of responded with our own. We just don't hear about it because, the China and Russia, they don't really allow, cyber attacks on their infrastructure out into the open and free press like we do here. They don't have the duty of disclosure.
Yes, unless, CTI researchers discover the C2 infrastructure or the tools or attack that actually happens, it's hard to get that stuff out in public. And you bring up a good point, James, like since I left NSA and being in the private sector, that is a challenge. Like we don't know everything. We don't know what's going on in the SCIF. We don't know what NSA is seeing and what CIA and FBI are working on. All we know is what they tell us, which is one of the challenges from the SolarWinds incident and the FireEye incident is we don't know all the details. At first, I thought to myself, this sounds like China. Like it's a supply chain attack. That's classic. There's the motivation behind it. Look at the targets. They've targeted think tanks and critical infrastructure, government agencies. It could have been China or Russia. But what they were telling us was so little that we were just trying to piece things together into a puzzle. So I think it's important to always keep that in mind. Like, we don't know all the things. And one of the solutions I see is that I think the government needs to be more transparent. Tell us why you think it's Russia. What kind of tools did you discover? Have you built defensive measures for it, written signatures to detect it? How do we block this? And of course they have since then come out with more information. But the first time we talked, we were like, I don't know, it could be China. But yeah, it's hard to know. People are calling this SolarWinds incident cyber Pearl Harbor. And I think they're trying to give it this imagery and this title so that they can justify a counterattack, like an act of war. But really, it was a cyber espionage campaign. From what we can tell right now, it was espionage, which is different than like a destructive cyber attack.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we're at the top of the hour. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So Charity, thank you again. And Paul, we send it back to you.
So thank you, James and Charity. Learned a lot of information this hour. This is great. Before we shut down, wanted to note that we have a March virtual luncheon coming up with Ms. Margaret Glover, who's going to be talking about CMMC and about how you can really handle it. It's not as difficult as everybody's making out. And then in April, we're going to have a live event at the University of North Georgia with Lieutenant General Stephen Fogarty and Peter Kress doing a one-on-one. And then in May, we've got a Critical Infrastructure Summit coming up. So there's a lot of activities coming up. This event today will be posted on our YouTube channel within the next day or two. Thank you guys very much for joining.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
You too.
Thanks.